Hello and welcome to another episode of Interviews with Hyperpolyglots at HYPIA. I am the president, Dr. Usman Chohan, and today I have the pleasure of having one of our earliest members, Haremska, join us for a delightful chat. Welcome, Yulia.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I just had a nice informal chat with you, got to learn about you, and I understand that the work that you have been doing is very exciting. It's also very important, but I want to concentrate today on the languages that you speak because it's delightful to hear of your journey. Tell us a little bit about the languages that you speak currently.
So that's a tricky question, as you probably know. How many languages do you speak, or what does it mean to speak a language? Because it entails so many aspects and so many levels. So my native language is Polish. I was born in Poland. My family is Polish, so that's my first language, and the only language I knew for many years. Then at school, I had English and French. Then I learned Spanish at some point, and I studied in Spain actually in university. I learned Italian in the meantime, just for fun, because I like the language. My degree was in Arabic, so that's how I became familiar with formal Arabic, and then I learned several dialects at different levels, let's say. In the meantime, I picked up Portuguese while traveling mostly. When I studied in Austria, I learned German. I lived there for 3 years, so I had enough time to sort of become quite familiar with it, but it's still a language that I don't feel particularly confident in, I have to say. Am I missing something? Yes, I was learning Greek for a while and I completely forgot it because I didn't manage to, it's sad to say this, but I didn't manage to use it profusely enough to be really good.
Serbian? I think you're forgetting Serbian.
Forgetting Serbian, yes. I lived in Serbia for a year and I became reasonably fluent in Serbian, and then again I didn't use it much. So it's a thing I'm in quarantine right now, so I'm thinking of actually refreshing my Serbian to some decent usable level. And recently I picked up Russian. I went to Russia and I studied there on a language course for a few weeks. And it's reasonably easy for a Polish speaker to pick up Russian rather quickly. So it went well, but again, I haven't been using it that much lately. So it really needs refreshing. And then there's all these languages that I studied and I never became fluent in. So I have a passive knowledge of them to a degree that allows me to have a simple conversation perhaps, but I would never say, let's say that I speak Farsi, or that I would speak I don't know, Yiddish or Hebrew, or all the languages that I became interested in at some point and that I never really mastered.
I understand. I think it's fascinating because one question is how much effort is required to acquire a new language. So when you say Russian isn't so bad because Polish, perhaps the same with a Slavic language like Serbian, it helps. Yeah. Similarly with the Romance languages, so once you picked up French, Spanish, and Italian and Portuguese, were not too much of a leap. However, making the leap from starting out in Polish and then ending up in Arabic requires deliberate effort, doesn't it? How was that effort?
True.
How did you go about it?
It's sort of how do I go about it? I have some level of I think it comes with some ease to me. I mean, I enjoy it, so it's easier to do something you really enjoy. There is an effort involved, definitely, and there's definitely many hours of exposing yourself to materials. I don't know, watching shows on YouTube or talking to people, actually traveling to the country. So sort of a multi-level effort in many fronts. But I'm actually the kind of person, and I hate to say this, but it's true. I'm actually the kind of person that actually likes grammar books. People laugh at me about this because it says, I mean, they say that it sounds like I'm. It's a really nerdy thing to say, and it's a really nerdy thing to do. But I actually enjoy it. Like I really enjoy. It for me, it's like a puzzle. It's like like a game. So, you know, suddenly, let's say you see this sentence that is completely obscure, and 2 weeks later, 4 chapters into the book, the grammar book, you can actually sort of, you get it, you can decompose what you're seeing, and with some additional effort, you can understand it, which it feels like a superpower when you get it, and it gives you a great boost. Of course, there are some languages, as you might know, that it doesn't happen that quickly. Let's say that German, this was my experience in German, for example, that you feel like you've been learning forever, and there's still so many opportunities to commit a mistake in each and every sentence, and you get one thing wrong, and then everything else is wrong as well.
Yes.
And it's so frustrating because you feel like, okay, I should be much better than I am right now. And then you keep sounding like you just started. Eventually this disappears, but this is, for me, it was a slow progress language. And then there's other languages like Spanish, where it feels like you learn 5 rules and you can talk. This is also not true, obviously, because it also has its complexities, but it's just, it encourages you a lot. It encourages me particularly when you know, you've put a little bit of effort into something, and then it gives you an immediate reward. You know, somebody speaks to you in that language, and you can talk to them, and you weren't able to do that a week before, and you feel like, okay, this is working, this is really good. Then it disappears because you stop using it because you get too confident. But it's fun. I would say it's just fun, more than anything else for me.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you touched upon the whole grammar nerd thing. You will find this as a common theme among hyperpolyglots. I can't recall a single member of HYPIA who said that, oh, I was just talking to the people, that's all it took. Honestly, they have a fascination with how the structure, even if it's not in writing, often it is, but even if they do visualize how the moving parts work, and the big challenges come after they leap outside their language family and they try another one, as you tried Arabic, and you say, oh, these are the other parts that move, my God. And so there is that nerdy aspect, but I don't like to think of it as nerdy per se. It's more aficionado. So they say, aha, so this is how this group of artists paints their language. That's more how they,
Yeah.
in an aesthetic manner. And the other point about that is that being a nerd is actually a cool thing. We're in 2020, and what our generation has done, as with some help from, you know, Gen Xers before us, is that they've made being nerdy a cool thing. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that for the oncoming generation, Gen Z, the fact that they are not obsessed about something in the abstract, they are not a nerd about something, would make them the odd one out today. What do you think?
Hard to say. It's just that, you know, I often get this reaction when people casually would ask me about languages I speak, and they either think I'm making it up when I tell them the number. They're like, no, this can't be true. You're exaggerating. Or it's a real I don't want to use the word turn off, but it's more like, oh my God, what kind of person are you? You know, so some people get really suspicious about it, and or they would think that I have some absolute I don't know, that I do nothing else in my life, let's say,
Yes.
which is not true, really. But I know people who speak double the amount of languages that I do.
Sure.
Or even triple, and I look up to them as well with the same way. Like, wow, you know, I thought 5 languages was a lot, or I thought 10 languages was a lot, but you speak 25, for example. How do you do that? You know, you must be really into it. So I get it, the way it works. It's just that a lot of the time, the reaction I get from people is astonishment, but it's also it creates a distance, because it sounds like I'm boasting, and I'm just answering their question.
Yes, absolutely. I think this point is something that all HYPIA members have remarked upon, including myself. You certainly put it in such a good way, is that when you try to relate to the general public, which is at most confined to 3 languages, that would already be extraordinary. 4, if they're really pushing it. Some people do speak 4 and they're not really working on it. then they look at you with a kind of suspicion, and that suspicion is well-founded because there is a lot of masquerading in the YouTube domain of polyglotism.
Yeah.
That means that a lot of people out there do throw a bunch of phrases, and when you do talk to them, you see that their knowledge is very superficial and hollow. But I cannot say that about other members of HYPIA, myself, or you, because I understand that you have deployed these languages, you have applied them, they're a part of who you are, and so there's no suspicion on my behalf. But if people apply to HYPIA all the time, one does need to be careful that they're not simply doing this gratuitously, because there is a kind of kick that comes in the nerd section. The kick comes that, wow, look, I can do this, ba, ba, ba. And in the meantime, there are people who will maintain that suspicion that actually they said they spoke my language and they really suck at it. So I understand why these doubts do linger, yet HYPIA is that body that celebrates the fact that you authentically do speak them. That is a big positive.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And actually, I can tell you from my experience that there's a lot more polyglots and even hyperpolyglots than we think. It's quite common for people to be bilingual globally, and then trilingual and quadrilingual is also quite common, for without much effort even. You know, people who were just exposed to the language of the father, the language of the mother, the language of the country they live in, the language of the country they move to, and that's it. And then, you know, they can learn 2 more languages, and it's already 6, or it's already 7. And it's very common in migrant populations, for example, all over the world. So it may seem for a Polish person in Poland that it's some superpower and incredible skill that takes a lot of work, and it often is, but they also don't realize how common it is in many other contexts where people simply, through circumstances that they were raised in, were exposed to many languages and they learned them, but they're not nerds. It doesn't make them nerds. It doesn't make them, they may not even have any formal education. Specifically, they just speak a lot of languages. It's a lot more common than we think it is.
This is an important distinction that our chat has drawn, because I haven't come across this in previous conversations, but it's very important to highlight what you have said. It's this, that there is the endogenous drive to learn, and that's very much an embodiment of privilege. I had that, you have that, many of a lot of the white members of HYPIA come across that. But then there's the exogenous imposition of circumstance, which you've touched upon. Migrant populations have that. They may not have formal education, as you said, and circumstances force their mind to adapt to a multiplicity of populations. Obviously, those people don't have the luxury of looking comfortably at things like HYPIA, but they would always be welcome to apply. There is no barrier to entry based on class or origin. We're very much an open-ended, flat organization. But I think this exogenous part of it is important when we consider our privilege in society. It's very important that you mentioned that. Another thing that I think is interesting, because we're talking about privilege now and all that, is dispelling the myth. You and about 30% of HYPIA, we're about 120 members, by the way. About 30% of them are women. So it's a 70-30 ratio. I mean, ideally it would be 50-50. But some people tell me that it's already quite amazing that you have 30% women, because the stereotype exists that hyperpolyglotism is very much a male phenomenon. And then when I enter into contact with people like you, women who are polyglots, totally comfortable using it as a normal part of your life in the same spirit as you do, like, oh, it's just what I do, what's the big deal? That reassures me that we can help to demolish this myth, because there is no such barrier in any individual learning many languages, depending on their circumstances and the effort they make. So you embody that as a woman polyglot. It's no big deal. I'm just a polyglot. Why even raise that, right? That kind of thing.
I think women are just as likely to be polyglots. Maybe they might be less likely to claim it, let's say, because it is still the case that I mean, I'm no expert on the matter, but it's something I've heard and I have anecdotal evidence for, is that women are encouraged to be very humble about their skills, and unless they are completely certain that they can claim something 100%, and have it completely unchallenged, they wouldn't really claim it, even though they might well have the right to it. So I would say, but maybe I'm wrong about this, I don't know, but it could be the case, you know, why you do have less women, because I know just as many female polyglots as male polyglots. So
yes. I think your judgment on this is absolutely right, because a lot of women, young women particularly, are hesitant to apply. And when they do finally muster the courage to apply, I say, or whoever's running their application says, well, why didn't you apply earlier? They said, because, well, I wasn't sure, that I was fluent in all 6 of them. They really women give themselves a hard time. So societal pressures, peer pressure, and the like. And guys don't do that. So a lot of applications would be like, well, it's 4.5. You can just round it up to 6, right? Come on, give me a break.
Yeah.
I'm pretty much 6. 4.5 is 6. 4.5 is not 6. So that the guys are also encouraged to take more risks. Even if they get slapped in the face and they don't have the substance, there's like, oh, just go for it, man, whatever.
Exactly.
So there is some truth.
That's correct.
Now, Arabic is one that you made a particular effort to learn, and you picked up several dialects in it. So talk to me about the dialects that you've picked up in Arabic, and what are the differences that you've observed, the degrees of differences you've observed? What's going on?
So that's something, you know, the complexity and the diversity that exists inside Arabic is something that I wish I had known before I started learning it, because it's an endless journey. It's been, what, 15 years right now, at least. And when somebody asks me, can you speak Arabic? I would always say, okay, but what version? You know, because it is not by no means a straightforward answer as it would be in Spanish or English, for example. Yes, there is a variety in Spanish, there is a variety in English, but it's mutually intelligible. All of them are mutually intelligible.
Except Australian English. Australian English, no.
You might be right with that, but still, you know, at the level of structure, these languages are still relatively uniform and connected. So you would say, you wouldn't say I speak Australian English, Canadian English, and British English and Irish English. You would speak one of them and you would understand all of them pretty well. Spanish the same, even French. But in terms of Arabic, it really is the fact that you first get familiar normally. If you study Arabic formally in university, as I did, you first get acquainted with the formal variety, with the modern standard Arabic or classical Arabic, depending on what your focus would be. And then you go to an Arab country and you realize that it is only of limited use to you. I mean, you can only use it in very formal contexts and such reduced manner that you basically have to learn it all over again. And it's true, you don't have to start from scratch to learn a dialect, because the basis is you already have it through formal Arabic, but it does take a considerable amount of effort to stop speaking formal Arabic, because people laugh at you when you do, in many ways, in many countries they do, or they find you, they feel uncomfortable in your presence because you introduce this air of incredible formality when you speak classical Arabic to them. It is funny. It is very funny, I have to say. Just the absurdity of it when the foreigner comes in and speaks classical Arabic, and people sometimes don't even know how to react because they're so unused to using formal Arabic in their daily life. So I was exposed to Moroccan dialect, which is so far removed from classical Arabic that it requires a lot of effort. I did learn it to some degree, and then I never really used it much ever again, but I still understand it quite well. I have to say this is probably the quirkiest Arabic dialect for a lot of people. It's usually quite like other Arab speakers find it exotic because it's so mixed with French and so far removed from what they are able to understand. That it probably could even count as a separate language, but I don't know if Moroccan people would agree with me on that, perhaps not. So that was one, and then Egyptian, because I lived in Egypt for a while and I learned the local dialect. And then through work, I was exposed more to the Levantine variety. So that would be Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian, Jordanian, you name it, which is closer to Egyptian. And there is a continuum there. So these are usually they're mutually intelligible dialects. But then, you know, it still comes to it from time to time. And I think every Arabic speaker can say this, that there comes a person to you from a certain region in the Arab world, and they count themselves as an Arabic speaker, and you count yourself as an Arabic speaker, and yet you have great difficulty understanding each other, and you both have to make an effort as a foreigner who speaks some version of Arabic, and you try to get closer to what your interlocutor is using, and he's also trying to make an effort to speak closer to the modern standard so that you can understand each other and meet somewhere in between. And so it's very challenging, I have to say, and also very rewarding, but incredibly challenging, because it's something I would say non-Arabic speakers are rarely aware of, the fact that you know, it's whether you speak Arabic or not is not a straightforward question you can answer.
Absolutely, and I think these nuances are very important to communicate to people who are outside the Arab sphere. And your professional title, I think, is one of the most beautiful professional titles. You are a cultural mediator. So who is a cultural mediator? What's this job like?
Well, I'm no longer a culture mediator right now in my capacity right at the moment, but I did work as a culture mediator for quite some time. And I have to say it's I don't know how long it's been around, but I think it's this term is a product of the recent migration into Europe and all that it entailed in terms of humanitarian efforts. So culture mediator is often mistaken with an interpreter, but I would say it's not the same as an interpreter at all, because an interpreter remains sort of withdrawn from the conversation, and he's just transferring bits and pieces of what is being said.
Sure.
And trying to make it as faithful as possible, whereas a culture mediator is also an interpreter in the same context, but he has additional functions, because his job is to transmit to both parts of the conversation, be it the doctor and the patient, or the lawyer and the client, whatever it might be, the nuances that might not be available in a standard conversation. So he would explain certain sensitivities to the doctor, saying, you know, let's better explain it this way, perhaps, or we should keep this in mind when explaining this to the patient in view of the sensitivity. But it goes both ways. So he would also explain to the patient why maybe certain questions are being asked, why something that is sensitive for him is not sensitive for the doctor, etc., etc. So it's a first person that the beneficiary would come into contact with when dealing with a humanitarian organization in some contexts, and it's sort of I would say, you know, to put it in a short phrase, it's something in between a social worker and an interpreter and I don't know, an anthropological / cultural advisor. It's and the people who act as culture mediators are often from same or similar cultural backgrounds as the beneficiaries. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're like me. I'm not. I wasn't born in the Arab world. I acquired the language, but and I got familiar with the culture over time. But I'm not part of the community, let's say. So it's a very beautiful job, I think, and language is just a part of it. There's a whole big range of skills that is required to be a good culture mediator, and it's a very tough job to have. But I have to say it was really an amazing and enjoyable experience to work as a culture mediator, the time I spent.
Sounds like an exhilarating profession, and I think it would appeal to a lot of young people. and particularly people who are into culture and languages as well as contributing to society, they may not even be aware that this job title exists. I was not particularly aware of it myself, but when I reflect on it, I think it's a fascinating domain. Of course, it has its ups and downs, as you allude to, but in terms of the reward, I can only imagine that it's been quite a meaningful journey for you. And I think that for the audience listening in, I think that this is something to think about in terms of how you can create value for society using languages, that it's not just about you reading through grammar books or just having, silly YouTube chats or, swiping right on Tinder in different languages. There's more to life than that. And a cultural mediator is a good example of creating value for the public. So I admire
Definitely.
you.
And also there's formal education available right now in some institutions in Europe to become a culture mediator. There's courses coming up. So I would say it's a growing profession. And I was also not aware it existed for some time, and then I suddenly became a culture mediator. So I definitely encourage people to look into this if this is something they like to do, if they like to speak to people, if they like, because for instance, I'm not a translation person. I have huge respect for translators, but personally, when I do written translations, I find it uninspiring in many levels. It's just my own personality that doesn't really fit well with spending hundreds of hours over a legal document.
Oh, yes.
That's something that appeals to a lot of people. It doesn't really appeal to me. I prefer the conversational aspect of the language, and the culture mediator is something where you can really put that into work. It's a really lovely opportunity, and it's in many countries right now. It's growing in Southern Europe. I know it's a growing profession, but I'm pretty sure it's also available in other parts of the world under a different title, perhaps. No idea.
Have you considered teaching this, because you're saying courses are emerging in the future? One day, would you like to teach from your own practitioner experience?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not, as I said, I'm not a culture mediator right now.
Yes.
So, there might be developments happening that I'm not aware of. So I don't think I would, well, maybe, who knows, but I don't know if I would be the right person, because I only have a limited experience in that regard.
Your first language is Polish. You grew up in Poland. Talk a little bit about your contemporary experience. How much Polish do you use in your daily life today? And what was it like growing up there?
So I still use quite a lot of Polish. I haven't lived in Poland for at least 15 years, or I mean, I've spent periods in Poland, but I haven't been permanently established there since I finished high school. But still, I'm in touch with my family, of course, and with my friends, and Polish is still my first language of reference for a lot of things. I read a lot in Polish. Polish culture is still very important to me. It's something I think it's a little bit undervalued globally, because it's such a, well, it's not a small language, but let's say it's only spoken in one country. So, and it's not very widely spoken outside of Poland, but Poland has very rich heritage, and especially in terms of literature and film, it is very vibrant. So, my favorite authors are all Polish authors, for instance, until now.
Who are they? Name your authors. Name your favorite authors.
So Andrzej Stasiuk is one of my favorite authors. Olga Tokarczuk, who recently got a Nobel Prize, is one of my favorite authors. Krzysztof Varga. And then there's all the poetry. And then there's all the journalist literature, let's say, fact. So reportage, the Polish school of reportage, you have Ryszard Kapuściński, who's the name that is sort of globally known and translated into multiple languages. But then, following his tradition, you have dozens of very good non-fiction writers who are from Poland, who are excellent. Wojciech Tochman, Mariusz Szczygieł. They write about Poland, they write about global issues as well, and they're very, very good. And yeah, so this is what I read. So I still read, I would say 80% in Polish.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the other languages, but Polish is probably still my number one language in terms of art, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
and consuming literature, movies, and stuff like that. And growing up in Poland, yeah, I was lucky. I mean, it was a good place to grow up. I got a good education, I have to say, in Poland. I mean, I didn't study in university in Poland, but my high school was very decent, and it was free. And so yeah, I mean, I no longer live in Poland, but it's still an important place for me, I have to say.
I think that's wonderful. I have a strong connection to Poland myself, and that's why I'm particularly
Yeah.
curious about the diaspora, so to say, if we can consider you the diaspora, even though you are still deeply attached to it, in a sense, because your life has been so dynamic over the past 15 years, you may be considered part of the diaspora. And so how deeply do you connect? Well, the answer is very strongly. So I think that's very, very positive. I myself am now based in Pakistan, but for most of my time abroad, that's 25 years of my life abroad, I always did feel like I had one foot here, always. And then now that I am here, I feel like I have 2 feet outside. That's how it is. When you're here, you think outside, and when you are outside, you think inside. That's just part of the migratory experience, which you've interacted with at different levels. One thing in that is that what happens in Pakistan, and I'm relating this back to what you've experienced in Morocco, is that people here do not speak their original language in totality in everyday conversation. They mix it with something else, usually the colonial language, because they're not really thinking in one language or the other. They're thinking in a jumbled space.
Yeah.
It's very common for me if I speak to you in Urdu, not me, because I'm quite purist, but other people around me here, they will throw in a lot of English when they speak Urdu and throw in a lot of Urdu when they speak English. The same happens in Morocco, where there'll be a ton of French. And so isn't it true that the fact that you spoke French helped you a lot when you engaged with Moroccan for that reason?
Absolutely, yeah. I would say this is the main reason why it was relatively easy. And why it is so hard to understand for people in other Arab countries whose level of exposure to French is none or very little, except maybe in Lebanon, but that's an exception. But then,
yes, old generation also.
Exactly. So Moroccan speakers of Moroccan dialect, they use very often so much French that this is the confounding variable. You know, this is where Arabic speakers get lost, because there's so many words that they don't recognize, and ordinarily a French speaker might not recognize them either, because they have been integrated into the dialect so much that they no longer sound French really, or they're distorted in a way that is they're unrecognizable. But I personally, I love that aspect, you know, the mixture and of the different levels of mixing different languages. It's something that is very natural. You say you're a purist. I'm not really a purist, because for me, languages are tools. So if there's a word I like in a language, I would use it. You know, I would throw it in. If my interlocutor understands it, then we can just mix and match as we like.
Instrumentalism. That's cool. That's fine.
Exactly. But the fact of mixing is something you see everywhere, I would say.
Oh yes.
And here in Arab countries, it's something locals do. If they're using a lot of English in their professional life, and they'll be putting it into their daily life a lot. Arabic students do the same thing. You know, you would be among people who studied Arabic, and you would speak English to each other, and then you would throw in Arabic words all the time, like yalla, or that's a classic example. You know, every Arab student, every person who studied Arabic uses yalla in their everyday life, and their family is puzzled because they don't know what they're saying. For them, it just became natural to use these Arabic expressions. But yeah, in terms of knowing different words and different bits and pieces of different languages, it just makes it easier. Obviously, it's a truism, but it's a cliche, but it's true. I mean, every new language is easier than the previous one, because there's already a number of elements that you're familiar with that you can relate to. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's why learning Mandarin, I believe, as you told me, you learned Mandarin, is must be quite challenging because there the amount of elements you're familiar with is less than it would be for Indo-European language speaker.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with Chinese, all of the dialects put together, all of your basic assumptions for languages get thrown out the window.
Fair
It's
enough. Yeah,
ideogrammatic. Every word has an ideogram attached to it, logograms technically,
exactly.
and it's tonal. That means that, for
Exactly.
example, your city, Wuj, there's also a
Yeah.
Wuj and a Wuj,
Okay.
and they're
I
different
like the way it
words.
sounds.
Wuj, and it's you have to pay attention to
Mandarin.
that. Now, I did apply shortcuts in the way you did because this got me thinking. For example, with people from Shanghai,
Yeah.
and they're quite cosmopolitan and all that, even though I lived in Beijing, with
Hmm.
Shanghai people, they're bourgeois and they're very cosmopolitan. I did throw in a lot of English to pump in the words that I didn't, because I could not infer from any other etymology.
Hmm.
I just needed to know the English word because I didn't know any word for it. And it almost seemed fashionable. Like I'm a Californian guy who's throwing in English
Yeah.
words into the Chinese with the Shanghai people, so your thesis is absolutely correct that we do mix languages according to the convenience or the necessity. But
Hmm.
the study of Chinese was literally something ab initio, that you forget everything you know about every language and you start totally from
Yeah.
nothing and then build something. Now, the requirement then is that you must maintain it deeply.
Okay.
So, for example, the way you are with Arabic, it's such an important part of your life, it's pretty much impossible for you to forget it. But for somebody like me who left China 5 years ago, I
Hmm.
was top of my class there, but
Hmm.
then when I was done with that, then I was also psychologically done with that. Like, okay, it's done. I'm good. Now move on. I did my doctoral work in English, for example, so didn't apply it anymore.
There you go.
And so you really have to keep those ties. And this is a challenge that you and I, others face as well, is that you may put the effort into a language, but if you don't persist, you're likely to forget. Like
It's
for
like a
Greek for you.
muscle, It's like a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it goes away because the brain is lazy in a way. If you don't use a certain part of it, oh, it's not part of it, but if you don't use those connections that you created, they're just vanish or over time. So, I mean, I get that with German, for example. I can read German, I can speak German, but I use it relatively rarely. So I went to Germany a couple of weeks ago, and it took me a while, to kind of, get into it.
Mhm.
My first 10 minutes in German, I was struggling. I was really like every sentence was painful, but then at the end of the day, it was just as easy as it was 5 years ago. But
Yes.
it's tough. This is the tough part. But I do realize that, I mean, in a way, the context that I work with, I'm quite lucky because I get to see people from all over the world. So I have opportunities to use languages with them that you don't normally get when you're in your country and surrounded by people who speak your language. But I know that I think the most famous or the biggest registered hyperpolyglots in Europe is a gentleman who works at the European Commission, I believe,
He's one
as
of the
the
most
interpreter.
famous. Yes. Yes. The Greek guy.
So he definitely gets opportunities to use all his 30 plus languages on a daily basis. So that's how he keeps them alive. Because otherwise, it's a real challenge. Even with 10 languages, it's a challenge to speak them every day or even once a week.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the difficulties where you do aspire to more, but there's only so much the brain can do. There is also the aging hypothesis that, as you get older, it
Exactly.
does become tougher. Are you finding that, or is that not a thing for you yet?
Not really.
Good.
Not really. I mean, I haven't made, perhaps I'm about to reach that point, and there's going to be a downward slope from then, but not yet.
Hmm.
um, Rather the opposite, because it as I feel like it gets more solid with age. Because I know more languages, then it's easier to learn new ones. But it's the maintenance that is hard, and harder,
Hmm.
definitely.
I do envy you for the application of languages that you get in your daily life. My work is very solitary. And so I do, for example,
Mhm.
publish in languages that are not my mother tongue all the time, but that's more of an output out of me rather than an input. So I wish I was able to get inputs in the same dynamic fashion that you. So you should consider that a plus of the work you do.
It is a plus, and moving around is a plus, and the fact that you live among other people who are, speak all sorts of languages. It's not just people who speak Arabic. It's also other people like you who came here or to a different country where you work, who are from all over the world, and they are from Brazil, Spain, Italy, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely a plus. It's definitely a plus. It makes it harder to forget languages. Although I do find that if you reach a certain level, now you do have to reach it consistently, it becomes harder to forget it. Like, I don't think I could ever forget Spanish, for instance. But perhaps it does get weaker in the sense that there's vocabulary I'm no longer using, and maybe it disappears. I don't know. I haven't really tested that, but
Don't.
It probably does happen. It probably does happen.
Yeah. And so we're having this conversation in the background of the pandemic. You are in quarantine right now. So how has coronavirus impacted you in 2020? How significant has it been for your life, for your language learning, for your work?
It has been, it has been quite significant in the sense that I haven't been able to work for a while properly. I mean, I was because of the closure of airports and closure of borders, I spent a lot more time with my family than I normally would have. I was supposed to leave in February, and I left a couple of weeks ago. So that was number one impact. But on the other hand, I had a lot of time suddenly. I know it's a huge privilege because a lot of people did not have that time. A lot of people were working outside every day, and they have no, there was no luxury for them in terms of being confined at home. But I was confined at home, and I was reading a lot, and I was studying a lot. So in that sense, it was a good language learning / language practicing period for me. But yeah, the fact that I'm going to stay here for another 2 weeks and then another 2 weeks home quarantine, yeah, it's a challenging time.
I understand, but it is an opportunity to do things that you might not otherwise have done, and that's the positive way to approach it. In the interest of the discipline that we need to keep for these interviews, because you are such a fascinating person and other HYPIA members also have such interesting stories to tell, we should keep our interviews to the limited extent that we do. I want to thank you profoundly for the time that you've spent. You are a very busy person. You are doing amazing work out there, and you set an example for how language can be applied for the benefit of others, not just for the benefit of oneself. So for people interested in HYPIA and other members already, this is an example of someone who can be reflected as the case study, that there is more to language than oneself. Language is all about N+1. And so she's contributing to something bigger than herself. So thank you very much for your time, Julia.
Thank you very much for your time. And thanks a lot for the kind words.
My pleasure.